Self-righteousness is a loud din raised to drown the voice of guilt within us. There is a guilty conscience behind every brazen word and act, and behind every manifestation of self-righteousness. 70. To wrong those we hate is to add fuel to our hatred. Conversely, to treat an enemy with magnanimity is to blunt our hatred for him. Sorry, I'm stumbling. 71. The most effective way to silence our guilty conscience is to convince ourselves and others that those we have sinned against are indeed depraved creatures, deserving every punishment, even extermination. We cannot pity those we have wronged, nor can we be indifferent toward them. We must hate and persecute them, or else leave the door open to self-contempt. 72. A sublime religion invariably generates a strong feeling of guilt. There is an unavoidable contrast between loftiness of profession and imperfection of practice, and as one would expect, the feeling of guilt promotes hate and brazenness. Thus it seems that the more sublime the faith, the more virulent the hatred it breeds. 73. It is easier to hate an enemy with much good in him than one who is all bad. We cannot hate those we despise. The Japanese had an advantage over us in that they admired us more than we admired them. They could hate us more fervently than we could hate them. The Americans are poor haters in international affairs because of their innate feeling of superiority over all foreigners. An American's hatred for a fellow American, for Hoover or Roosevelt, is far more virulent than any antipathy he may evoke against foreigners. It is of this interest that the backward South shows more xenophobia than the rest of the country. Should Americans begin to hate foreigners wholeheartedly, it would be an indication that they have lost confidence in their own way of life. The undercurrent of admiration and hatred manifests itself in the inclination to imitate those we hate. Thus every mass movement shapes itself after its specific devil. Christianity at its height realized the image of the Antichrist. The Jacobians practiced all the evils of the tyranny they had risen against. Soviet Russia, in realizing the purest and most colossal example of monopolistic capitalism. Hitler took the prodigals of the wise men of Zion for his guide and textbooks. He followed them down to the veriest detail. It is startling to see how the oppressed almost invariably shape themselves in the image of the hated oppressors. That the evil men do lives after them is partially due to the fact that those who have reason to hate the evil most must shape themselves after it, and thus perpetuate it. It is obvious, therefore, that the influence of the fanatic is bound to be out of all proportion to his abilities. Both by converting and agonizing, he shapes the world in his own image. Fanatic Christianity puts its imprint upon the ancient world, both by gaining adherents and by evoking in its pagan opponents a strange fervor and ruthlessness. Hitler imposed himself upon the world both by promoting Nazism and by forcing the democracies to become zealous, intolerant, and ruthless. Communist Russia shapes both its adherents and its opponents in its own image. Thus, through a hatred is a convenient instrument for mobilizing community for defense, it does not in the long run come cheap. We pay for it by losing all or many of our values we have set out to defend. Hitler, who sensed the undercurrent of admiration and hatred, drew a remarkable conclusion. It is of the utmost importance, he said, that the National Socialist should seek and deserve the violent hatred of his enemies. Such hatred would be proof of the superiority of the National Socialist faith. The best yardstick for the value of the National Socialist attitude, for the sincerity of his conviction and the force of his will, is the hostility he receives from the enemy. 74. It seems that when we are oppressed by the knowledge of our worthlessness, we do not see ourselves as lower than some and higher than others, but as lower than the lowest of mankind. We hate them the whole world, and we would pour our wrath upon the whole of creation. There is a deep resonance of the frustrated in the witnessing the downfall of the fortunate and the disgrace of the righteous. They see in a general downfall an approach to the brotherhood of all. Chaos, like the grave, is a haven of equality. Their burning conviction that there must be a new life and a new order is fueled by the realization that the old will have to be razed to the ground before the new can be built. Their clamor for millennium is shot through with a hatred for all that exists and a craving for the end of the world. 75. Passion and hatred can give meaning and purpose to an empty life. Thus people haunted by purposelessness of their lives try to find a new content not only by dedicating themselves to a holy cause, but also by nursing a fanatical grievance. The mass movement offers them unlimited opportunities for both. 76. Whether it is true or not, as Pascal says, that all men by nature hate each other, and that love and charity are only a faint and false image, for at the bottom they are but hate, one cannot escape the impression that hatred is an all-pervading ingredient in the compounds and combinations of our inner life. All our enthusiasms, devotions, passions, and hopes, when they decompose, release hatred. On the other hand, it is possible to synthesize an enthusiasm, a devotion, and a hope by activating hatred. Said Martin Luther, "When my heart is cold and I cannot pray as I should, I scourge myself with the thought of the impiety and the ingratitude of my enemies, the Pope and his accomplices and vermin, and Zwingli, so that my heart swells with righteous indignation and hatred, that I can say with warmth and vehemence, Holy be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And the hotter I grow, the more earnest to my prayers become." Unity in 77. Unity and self-sacrifice of themselves, even when fostered by the most noble means, produce a facility for hating. Even when men league themselves mightily together to promote tolerance and peace on earth, they are likely to be violently intolerant toward those not of a like mind. The estrangement from the self, without which there can be neither selflessness nor full assimilation of the individual into a compact whole, produces, as already mentioned, a proclivity for passionate attitudes, including passionate hatred. There are also other factors which favor the growth of hatred in an atmosphere of unity and selflessness. The act of self-denial seems to confer on us the right to be harsh and merciless towards others. The impression somehow prevails that the true believer, particularly the religious individual, is a humble person. The truth is that the surrendering and humbling of the self breed pride and arrogance. The true believer is apt to see himself as one of the chosen, the salt of the earth, the light of the world, a prince disguised in meekness, who is destined to inherit this earth and the kingdom of heaven too. He not of his faith is evil. He who will not listen shall perish. There is also this. When we renounce the self and become part of the compact whole, we not only renounce personal advantage, but are also rid of personal responsibility. There is no telling to what extremes of cruelty and ruthlessness a man will go when he is freed from the fears, hesitations, doubts, and the vague stirrings of decency that go with individual judgment. When we lose our individual independence in the corporateness of a mass movement, we find a new freedom to hate, bully, lie, torture, murder, and betray without shame and remorse. Herein undoubtedly lies part of the attractiveness of a mass movement. We find there is the right to dishonor, which according to Dostoevsky has an irresistible fascination. Hitler had a contemptuous opinion of the brutality of the autonomous individual. Any violence, quote, any violence which does not spring from a firm spiritual base will be weaving and uncertain. It lacks the stability which can only rest in a fanatical outlook, end of quote. Thus hatred is not only a means of unification, but also its product. Renan, R-E-N-A-N, says that we have never since the world began heard of a merciful nation. Nor, one may add, have we heard of a merciful church or a merciful revolutionary party. The hatred and cruelty, which are their source in selfishness and ineffectual things, compared with the venom and ruthlessness born of selflessness. When we see the bloodshed, terror, and destruction born of such generous enthusiasm, the love of God, love of Christ, love of a nation, compassion for the oppressed, and so on, we usually blame the shameful perversion of a cynical, power-hungry leadership. Actually, it is the unification set in motion by these enthusiasms rather than the manipulations of a scheming leadership that transmutes noble impulses into reality of hatred and violence. The de-individualization, which is a prerequisite for thought, integration, and selfless dedication, is also, to a considerable extent, a process of dehumanization. The torture chamber is a corporate institution. Imitation, 78. Imitation is an essential unifying agent. The development of a close-knit group is inconceivable without a diffusion of uniformity. The one-mindedness and Gleichschaltung, Gleichschaltung, prized by every mass movement, are achieved as much by imitation as by obedience. Obedience itself consists as much of imitation of an example as in the following of a precept. Though the imitative capacity is present in all people, it can be stronger in some than in others. The question is whether the frustrated who, as suggested in section 43, not only have a propensity for united action, but also equipped with the mechanism for its realization, are particularly imitative. Is there a connection between frustration and the readiness to imitate? Is imitation, in some manner, a means of escape from the ills that beset the frustrated? The chief burden of the frustrated is the consciousness of a blemished, ineffectual self, and their chief desire to slough off unwanted self and begin a new life. They try to realize this desire either by finding a new identity or by blurring and camouflaging their individual distinctness, and both these ends are reached by imitation. The less satisfaction we derive from being ourselves, the greater is our desire to be like others. We are therefore more ready to imitate those who are different from us than those nearly like us, and those we admire than those we despise. The imitativeness of the oppressed, blacks and Jews, is notable. As to the blurring and camouflaging of the self, it is achieved solely by imitation, by becoming like others as possible. The desire to belong is partially a desire to lose oneself. Finally, the lack of self-confidence, characteristic of the frustrated, also stimulates their imitativeness. The more we mistrust our judgment and luck, the more we are ready to follow the example of others. 79. Mere rejection of the self, even when not accompanied by a search for a new identity, can lead to increased imitativeness. The rejected self ceases to assert its claim to distinctness, and there is nothing to resist the propensity to copy. This situation is not unlike that observed in children and undifferentiated adults, where the lack of a distinct individuality leaves the mind without guards against the intrusion of influences from without. 80. A feeling of superiority counteracts imitation. Had the millions of immigrants who came to this country been superior people, the cream of the countries that they came from, there would have been not one USA, but a mosaic of lingual and cultural groups. It was due to the fact that the majority of the immigrants were of the lowest and the poorest, the despised and the rejected, that the heterogeneous millions blended so rapidly and thoroughly. They came here with the ardent desire to shed their old world identity and to be reborn to a new life. And they were automatically equipped with an unbounded capacity to imitate and adapt the new. The strangeness of the new country attracted rather than repelled them. They craved a new identity and a new life, and the stranger of a new world, and more suited their inclination. Perhaps to non-Anglo-Saxons, the strangeness of the language was an added attraction. To have to learn to speak enhanced the illusion of being born anew. 81. Imitation is often a shortcut to a solution. We copy when we lack the inclination, the ability, or the time to work out an independent solution. People in a hurry will imitate more readily than people at leisure. Hustling thus tends to produce uniformity, and in the deliberate fusing of an individuals into a compact group, incessant actions will play a considerable role. 82. Unification of itself, whether brought about by persuasion, coercion, and spontaneous surrender, tends to intensify the imitation capacity. A civilian drafted into the army and made a member of a close-knit military unit becomes more imitative than he was in civilian life. A unified individual is without a distinct self. He is perennially incomplete and immature, and therefore without resistance against influences from without. The marked imitativeness of primitive people is perhaps due less to their primitiveness than to the fact that they are usually members of the compact clans or tribes. The ready imitativeness of a unified following is both an advantage and a peril to a mass movement. The faithful are easily led and molded, but they are also particularly susceptible to foreign influences. One has the impression that a thoroughly unified group is easily seduced and corrupted. The preaching of all mass movements bristles with admonitions against copying foreign models and doing after all their abominations. The imitation of outsiders is branded as treason and apostasy. Whoever copies a foreigner is guilty of lèse nation, an insult to the nation, like a spy who admits an enemy by a secret doorway. Every device is used to cut off the faithful from intercourse with unbelievers. Some mass movements go to the extreme of leading their following into the wilderness in order to allow an undisturbed settling for a new pattern of life. Contempt for the outside world is, of course, the most effective defense against disruptive imitation. However, an active mass movement prizes hatred above passive contempt, and hatred does not stifle imitation but often simulates it. See Section 73. Only the case of small corporate bodies enclosed in a sea of foreigners and intent solely on preserving their distinctiveness is contempt employed as an insulator. It leads to an exclusiveness inhospitable to converts. The imitativeness of its members give the thoroughly unified group great flexibility and adaptability. It can adapt innovations and change its orientation with astounding ease. The rapid modernization of unified Japan or Turkey contrasts markedly with the slow and painful adaptation to new ways in China, Iran, and other countries not animated by a spirit of unity. A thoroughly unified, this is obviously written, I think, before 1979, a thoroughly unified Soviet Russia has a better chance of assimilating new methods and a new way of life than a loosely joined Russia of the Tsars. It is also obvious that the primitive people with an intact collective framework can be more readily modernized than one with a crumbling tribal or communal pattern. First